Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant, complete by Ulysses S. Ulysses Simpson, Grant. Chapter 21. General Halleck in command, commanding the District of Cairo movement on Fort Henry. Capture of Fort Henry. While at Cairo, I had frequent opportunities of meeting the rebel officers of the Columbus garrison. They seemed to be very fond of coming up on steamers under flags of truce. On 2 or 3 occasions I went down in like manner. When one of their boats was seen coming up carrying a white flag, a gun would be fired from the lower battery at Fort Holt, throwing a shot across the bow as a signal to come no farther. I would then take a steamer and, with my staff and occasionally a few other officers, go down to receive the party. There were several officers among them whom I had known before, both at West Point and in Mexico. Seeing these officers who had been educated for the profession of arms, both at school and in actual war, which is a far more efficient training, impressed me with the great advantage the South possessed over the North at the beginning of the rebellion. They had from 30 to 40% of the educated soldiers of the nation. They had no standing army, and consequently, these trained soldiers had to find employment with the troops from their own states. In this way, what there was of military education and training was distributed throughout their whole army. The whole loaf was leavened. The North had a great number of educated and trained soldiers, but the bulk of them were still in the army and were retained, generally with their old commands and rank, until the war had lasted many months. In the Army of the Potomac there was what was known as the Regular Brigade, in which, from the commanding officer down to the youngest second lieutenant, every one was educated to his profession. So, too, with many of the batteries, all the officers, generally 4 in number to each, were men educated for their profession. Some of these went into battle at the beginning under division commanders who were entirely without military training. This state of affairs gave me an idea which I expressed while at Cairo, that the government ought to disband the regular army, with the exception of the Staff Corps, and notify the disbanded officers that they would receive no compensation while the war lasted except as volunteers. The register should be kept up, but the names of all officers who were not in the volunteer service at the close should be stricken from it. On the 9th of November, 2 days after the Battle of Belmont, Major General H. W. Halleck superseded General Fremont in command of the Department of the Missouri. The limits of his command took in Arkansas and West Kentucky east to the Cumberland River. From the Battle of Belmont until early in February 1862, the troops under my command did little except prepare for the long struggle which proved to be before them. The enemy at this time occupied a line running from the Mississippi River at Columbus to Bowling Green and Mill Springs, Kentucky. Each of these positions was strongly fortified, as were also points on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers near the Tennessee state line. The works on the Tennessee were called Fort Hyman and Fort Henry, and that on the Cumberland was Fort Donelson. At these points the two rivers approached within 11 miles of each other. The lines of rifle pits at each place extended back from the water at least 2 miles, so that the garrisons were in reality only 7 miles apart. These positions were of immense importance to the enemy, and of course correspondingly important for us to possess ourselves of. With Fort Henry in our hands, we had a navigable stream open to us up to Muscle Shoals, in Alabama. The Memphis and Charleston Railroad strikes the Tennessee at Eastport, Mississippi, and follows close to the banks of the river up to the shoals. This road, of vast importance to the enemy, would cease to be of use to them for through traffic the moment Fort Henry became ours. Fort Donelson was the gate to Nashville, a place of great military and political importance, and to a rich country extending far east in Kentucky. These 2 points in our possession, the enemy would necessarily be thrown back to the Memphis and Charleston road, or to the boundary of the Cotton States, and, as before stated, that road would be lost to them for through communication. The designation of my command had been changed after Halleck's arrival, from the district of southeast Missouri to the district of Cairo, and the small district commanded by General C. F. Smith, embracing the mouths of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers had been added to my jurisdiction. Early in January 1862, I was directed by General McClellan, through my department commander, to make a reconnaissance in favor of Brigadier General Don Carlos Buell, who commanded the Department of the Ohio, with headquarters at Louisville, and who was confronting General S. B. Buckner with a larger Confederate force at Bowling Green. It was supposed that Buell was about to make some move against the enemy, and my demonstration was intended to prevent the sending of troops from Columbus, Fort Henry, or Donelson to Buckner. I at once ordered General Smith to send a force up the west bank of the Tennessee to threaten Forts Hyman and Henry. McClellan at the same time with a force of 6,000 men was sent out into West Kentucky, threatening Columbus with one column and the Tennessee River with another. I went with McClellan's command. The weather was very bad, snow and rain fell, the roads, never good in that section, were intolerable. We were out more than a week splashing through the mud, snow and rain, the men suffering very much. The object of the expedition was accomplished. The enemy did not send reinforcements to Bowling Green, and General George H. Thomas fought and won the Battle of Mill Springs before we returned. As a result of this expedition, General Smith reported that he thought it practicable to capture Fort Hyman. This fort stood on high ground, completely commanding Fort Henry on the opposite side of the river, and its possession by us, with the aid of our gunboats, would ensure the capture of Fort Henry. This report of Smith's confirmed views I had previously held, that the true line of operations for us was up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. With us there, the enemy would be compelled to fall back on the east and west entirely out of the state of Kentucky. On the 6th of January, before receiving orders for this expedition, I had asked permission of the general commanding the department to go to see him at St. Louis. My object was to lay this plan of campaign before him. Now that my views had been confirmed by so able a general as Smith, I renewed my request to go to St. Louis on what I deemed important military business. The leave was granted, but not graciously. I had known General Halleck but very slightly in the old army, not having met him either at West Point or during the Mexican War. I was received with so little cordiality that I perhaps stated the object of my visit with less clearness than I might have done, and I had not uttered many sentences before I was cut short as if my plan was preposterous. I returned to Cairo very much crestfallen. Flag Officer Foote commanded the little fleet of gunboats then in the neighborhood of Cairo and, though in another branch of the service, was subject to the command of General Halleck. He and I consulted freely upon military matters, and he agreed with me perfectly as to the feasibility of the campaign up the Tennessee. Notwithstanding the rebuff I had received from my immediate chief, I therefore, on the 28th of January, renewed the suggestion by telegraph that, if permitted, I could take and hold Fort Henry on the Tennessee. This time I was backed by Flag Officer Foote, who sent a similar dispatch. On the 29th I wrote fully in support of the proposition. On the 1st of February I received full instructions from Department Headquarters to move upon Fort Henry. On the 2d the expedition started. In February 1862, there were quite a good many steamers laid up at Cairo for want of employment, the Mississippi River being closed against navigation below that point. There were also many men in the town whose occupation had been following the river in various capacities, from captain down to deckhand, but there were not enough of either boats or men to move at one time the 17,000 men I proposed to take with me up the Tennessee. I loaded the boats with more than half the force, however, and sent General McClellan in command. I followed with one of the later boats, and found McClellan had stopped, very properly, 9 miles below Fort Henry. 7 gunboats under Flag Officer Foote had accompanied the advance. The transports we had with us had to return to Paducah to bring up a division from there, with General C. F. Smith in command. P. 289. JPG. 61K, full size before sending the boats back. I wanted to get the troops as near to the enemy as I could without coming within range of their guns. There was a stream emptying into the Tennessee on the east side, apparently at about long-range distance below the fort. Annika. Nt of the narrow watershed separating the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers at that point, the stream must be insignificant at ordinary stages, but when we were there, in February, it was a torrent. It would facilitate the investment of Fort Henry materially if the troops could be landed south of that stream. To test whether this could be done, I boarded the gunboat Essex and requested Captain William Porter, commanding it, to approach the fort to draw its fire. After we had gone some distance past the mouth of the stream, we drew the fire of the fort, which fell much short of us. In consequence, I had made up my mind to return and bring the troops to the upper side of the creek, when the enemy opened upon us with a rifled gun that sent shot far beyond us and beyond the stream. One shot passed very near where Captain Porter and I were standing, struck the deck near the stern, penetrated and passed through the cabin and so out into the river. We immediately turned back, and the troops were debarked below the mouth of the creek. When the landing was completed, I returned with the transports to Paducah to hasten up the balance of the troops. I got back on the 5th with the advance, the remainder following as rapidly as the steamers could carry them. At 10 o'clock at night, on the 5th, the whole command was not yet up. Being anxious to commence operations as soon as possible before the enemy could reinforce heavily, I issued my orders for an advance at 11 a.m. on the 6th. I felt sure that all the troops would be up by that time. Fort Henry occupies a bend in the river which gave the guns in the water battery a direct fire down the stream. The camp outside the fort was entrenched, with rifle pits and outworks 2 miles back on the road to Donelson and Dover. The garrison of the fort and camp was about 2,800, with strong reinforcements from Donelson halted some miles out. There were 17 heavy guns in the fort. The river was very high, the banks being overflowed except where the bluffs come to the water's edge. A portion of the ground on which Fort Henry stood was 2 feet deep in water. Below, the water extended into the woods several hundred yards back from the bank on the east side. On the west bank, Fort Hyman stood on high ground, completely commanding Fort Henry. The distance from Fort Henry to Donelson is but 11 miles. The two positions were so important to the enemy, as he saw his interest, that it was natural to suppose that reinforcements would come from every quarter from which they could be got. Prompt action on our part was imperative. The plan was for the troops and gunboats to start at the same moment. The troops were to invest the garrison and the gunboats to attack the fort at close quarters. General Smith was to land a brigade of his division on the west bank during the night of the 5th and get it in rear of Hyman. At the hour designated, the troops and gunboats started. General Smith found Fort Hyman had been evacuated before his men arrived. The gunboats soon engaged the water batteries at very close quarters, but the troops which were to invest Fort Henry were delayed for want of roads, as well as by the dense forest and the high water in what would in dry weather have been unimportant beds of streams. This delay made no difference in the result. On our first appearance, Tillman had sent his entire command, with the exception of about 100 men left to man the guns in the fort, to the outworks on the road to Dover and Donelson, so as to have them out of range of the guns of our navy, and before any attack on the 6th he had ordered them to retreat on Donelson. He stated in his subsequent report that the defense was intended solely to give his troops time to make their escape. Tillman was captured with his staff and 90 men, as well as the armament of the fort, the ammunition and whatever stores were there. Our cavalry pursued the retreating column towards Donelson and picked up 2 guns and a few stragglers. But the enemy had so much the start that the pursuing force did not get in sight of any except the stragglers. All the gunboats engaged were hit many times. The damage, however, beyond what could be repaired by a small expenditure of money, was slight, except to the Essex. A shell penetrated the boiler of that vessel and exploded it, killing and wounding 48 men, 19 of whom were soldiers who had been detailed to act with the Navy. On several occasions during the war such details were made when the complement of men with the Navy was insufficient for the duty before them. After the fall of Fort Henry, Captain Phelps, commanding the ironclad Carondelet, at my request descended the Tennessee River and thoroughly destroyed the bridge of the Memphis and Ohio Railroad.